Okay, very good. You're going to speak from the... Yeah, great. Good afternoon. I'd like to get started. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center. I'm delighted to welcome all of you, also on behalf of my co-chair, William Roger Lewis, from the President, Director of the National History Center Initiative of the AHA, to this program. We're both delighted that so many of you have come despite the miserable weather outside, but I think it will be worthwhile the trip. We want to acknowledge here today the support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations for continuing to support this Washington history seminar, Historical Perspectives in International and National Affairs. Today we're featuring one of our own. I'm delighted to present Dr. Samuel Wells with a presentation on Stalin's decision for war in Korea, a presentation that grows out of his ongoing work on a major book on the subject. He is known to many of you, of course, as a longtime member of the Wilson Center family, directing various programs in his long tenure here, rising all the way up to deputy director and associate director of the center, and for the last couple of years now has been working on the book on the strategic buildup launched by the Truman administration as a result of the Korean War as a senior scholar here at the center. He's formerly taught a number of institutions, including Wellesley and then the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the author of a long list of publications, too many for me to read them all now, but just to name a couple: Shared Sovereignty in the European Union, Germany's Economic Statecraft, co-authored with Sherry Wells, The Korean War, Miscalculation and Alliance Transformed, Centralizing Power, Domestic Considerations in the Shaping and Implementation of the War on Terror after 9/11, as well as an edited volume, The Strategic Triangle, France, Germany, and the United States in the Shaping of the New Europe. With that, let me turn it over to Roger for any introductory remarks he'd like to make, and then Sam will have the floor. Again, it's wonderful to welcome Sam to this seminar as our speaker, and welcome to all of you. Roger?
Sam and I go back a long way. The Ernest May seminar at Harvard in the early 1960s, and I'm sure if we would have thought then that we would have been in this sort of situation, would have been a surprise to us. All I would like to say is a word of appreciation for all that Sam has done here at the Wilson Center over many years. Sam Wells on Stalin's decision for war in Korea.
Let me say a few words of context to let you know where this particular interpretation originates and where it will be placed in the book that I'm working on. For those of you who developed your understanding of the Korean War prior to 1989, this will be in part an old story, but with a number of new wrinkles. The new wrinkles come from the sources that came available from Soviet, Chinese, and Korean archives after the end of the Cold War. A collection of new resources that is largely attributable to the work of my colleagues in the Cold War International History Project, a project created, conceptualized by John Gaddis of Yale, who chaired our advisory committee, and operated with great energy and efficiency by James Hirschberg and my colleague Christian Osterman. More recently, we have relied upon a collaboration with the East China Normal University and Professor Xin Zhihua to provide further documentation on both Soviet and Chinese affairs. I will make use of the work of Professor Xin in this article and will give you some sense of how his own interpretation is evolving. This presentation is drawn from the first 3 chapters of a book on the Soviet-American strategic competition, a competition initiated by the Korean War. So the war and its course and its military operations are not, in fact, my principal subject, but the origins of the war and the extent to which the United States dimly understood those origins are very important in shaping strategic decisions taken in Washington. Joseph Stalin decided in late January 1950 to provide limited support to a North Korean invasion of the South on the conviction that this initiative would strengthen the position of the Soviet Union in Asia at very little risk. The Soviet Union was at that time recovering from the devastation of World War II and had consolidated its control over the important states of Eastern Europe. The communists had won a lengthy civil war in China. A Soviet-sponsored regime had established firm control in North Korea, whereas South Korea was riven with factional disputes and intrigue against the central government. In the United States, the administration of President Harry Truman was increasingly unpopular and under attack for poor management of foreign affairs and the economy. The President and the Secretary of State had recently announced a new strategy for Asia, which involved withdrawing from Taiwan and South Korea. In Moscow, Stalin was keenly aware of the legacies of the Great Patriotic War and the very substantial vulnerabilities that they still left with him and the leadership. The war had caused a minimum of 25 million deaths, including at least 9 million in military action, and the result of German occupation, a brutal cleansing of Soviet and related populations as they moved into the Soviet Union, preceded by Soviet purges of their own civilian and military senior staff. Many cities west of Moscow and at least 70,000 villages and towns were destroyed. Industrial production still emphasized capital goods over consumer items. Food supplies were always inadequate. By 1945, Stalin had gained full control of state power through a political system which operated on intrigue, intimidation, and terror. Starting in 1934 with the murder of Sergei Kirov, he had gradually centralized authority for himself and a small group of party protégés, as step by step he eliminated his potential rivals. In addition to having senior party officials tried and executed, Stalin ordered purges of senior military leaders, which removed the most capable and experienced generals and admirals on the eve of war with Germany. In her memoirs, Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Aloyeva, describes how after her mother's suicide in 1932, Stalin became increasingly isolated and suspicious of everyone. Specially chosen members of the secret police managed the household, cared for the children, and provided security. All of his food was especially grown or imported. Each element was tested and certified by doctors as free of poison. During the war, Stalin went to the front only once, during the preparations for the Smolensk offensive in August of 1943. After the war, Stalin seldom went into the Kremlin, but stayed in one of his dachas outside the city or in the south, which he preferred. A small circle of Politburo members had dachas nearby and often showed up for late frequently drunken dinners with the Soviet leader, who at this point encouraged his dinner companions to drink heavily while he himself, under doctor's orders, did not drink. He had had his imbibing earlier. His methods of centralizing power, together with his declining strength and physical isolation, meant that Stalin frequently lacked the information and analysis necessary for sound decisions. His top lieutenants were hesitant to report problems or failures. The most critical tasks often went to those of proven loyalty. But Stalin moved his top assistants to posts frequently to avoid them getting too entrenched and powerful. Senior advisors often screened information and negotiated recommendations with one another before putting problems before Stalin. And since the dictator was clearly declining, they frequently intrigued against one another to improve their chances of becoming his successor. By mid-1950, the most powerful leaders were Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Nikita Khrushchev as the newcomer to the inner circle. As Khrushchev biographer William Taubman describes their relationship, quote, whatever Khrushchev's precise role in Stalin's last years, the game he was playing required him simultaneously to befriend Malenkov and Beria and to betray them. A final limitation on Stalin's capacity to make good decisions was the fact that he had no foreign language beyond a bit of German, very little knowledge of foreign cultures or political systems. The Soviet dictator's top priority in foreign policy was to maintain control of Eastern Europe. He wanted to prevent a revived German military threat that might once again use Poland and Czechoslovakia as an invasion route. The Soviet dictator made some harsh decisions in the months following the communist coup in Prague in March 1948. In June, he started the process that would lead to the expulsion of Tito's Yugoslavia from the communist bloc, and he began to coerce the Western powers in Germany by blockading land access to their occupation zones in Berlin. The Soviets also initiated purges of Communist Party leaders to impose Moscow's policies in Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Zbigniew Brzezinski, when he was a young assistant professor at Columbia, wrote an important article that estimates that 1/4 of the party membership in the East European states was purged in the period after 1948. At the start of 1949, Soviet leaders had two main foreign policy goals. They wanted to stop the creation of a Western defensive alliance that would include the United States, and they wanted to prevent the formation of a separate West German government. Working through the French Communist Party, which was the most extensive and the most pliable, the Cominform tried first a peace offensive and then called for an attack on nationalism, trying to get citizens of the other European states to pledge never to fight against the Soviet Union on behalf of British and American imperialism. Both efforts failed and only added to the suspicion and anxiety created by the Berlin blockade. In April 1949, the nations of Western Europe joined the United States and Canada in forming NATO. The following month, the Federal Republic of Germany was created. The two goals defeated in successive months. The new allies then strengthened their defenses in important ways and agreed to extend the Marshall Plan for another 15 months. By August of 1949, Soviet influence had hit a low point as Western defenses grew stronger, while Moscow was increasingly isolated. While his attention was focused mainly on Europe, Stalin also had to deal with emerging challenges in Asia. By early 1949, the Chinese communists were on their way to winning the civil war against the nationalists. This was a surprise to Stalin, who had significant interest invested in continued nationalist rule. In 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Stalin had exacted large concessions in China from Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. He then pressured the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, to sign a treaty endorsing these privileges, including control of Outer Mongolia, special rights in Manchuria, a naval base in Lushan, a harbor in Dalian, and control of a railway linking Siberia to these ports. The Soviet leader wanted to retain these concessions and had maintained formal diplomatic relations with the nationalist government even after it had to evacuate its capital in Nanking in April. When the communists were on the edge of victory in the summer of 1949, Stalin still held to his low opinion of Mao Zedong and his peasant-based guerrilla strategy. He wanted to bring a communist China into the Soviet bloc, but he sought to keep Mao in a supplicant's position. He treated Mao coolly, never greeting him with the warm collegial phrases he used for the Communist Party leaders of France and Italy. He never issued a grand proclamation saluting the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. The founding of the People's Republic was announced on October 3rd on the front page of Pravda, the first time the communist victory had appeared on page 1. Shortly after his victory, Mao Zedong arranged a trip to Moscow to negotiate an alliance with the Soviet Union and to win commitments for economic assistance. He arrived on his first visit outside China on December 16th. He came with high hopes. He would remain in the Soviet capital for 2 months. Mao was the victorious leader of the most populous member of the communist world. Of all the party chieftains under communism, he owed the least to Stalin for his success. While he was aware of Stalin's brutal, imperious character, he was not prepared for the harsh greeting he received. He was welcomed by Vyacheslav Molotov, a Politburo member and first vice premier, and the reception for the delegation was held not in the Great Hall of the Kremlin, but in the old Metropole Hotel, the usual place, according to Adam Ulam, for entertaining visiting minor capitalist dignitaries. Mao was even more irritated with the early substantive exchanges. Although in his telegram proposing to visit Moscow, the Chinese leader had clearly indicated his desire to revise the 1945 Sino-Soviet Treaty, Stalin refused to discuss the subject in their first 2 meetings, contending that the Yalta agreements with the West made it undesirable and possibly dangerous to change the treaty. The West might, in its own right, ask for changes as well. Angry and frustrated, Mao retreated to his dacha and sulked for 8 days, happening to be over Western Christmas. Not a problem for him. Stalin finally sent Molotov and Anastas Mikoyan, another vice premier and Politburo member, to say that the Soviet leadership had changed their view and they would negotiate a new treaty. For 3 weeks, Soviet officials worked developing 12 draft agreements that met the approval of the Central Committee. They presented the key points to Mao on January 22nd, 1950. Mao and his chief negotiator and diplomat, who had just been brought in from Peking, as it was then called, for the negotiations, Zhou Enlai, looked at the proposals and saw that they were mildly repackaged elements from the 1945 treaty and offered very few concessions to the Chinese. In the last 15 months, 2 books from Professor Shin have been published in English, which take progressively different views of these Stalin-Mao negotiations. In the initial publication, published by the Wilson Center Press, Shin presents the negotiation as when Zhou got to Peking, he sat down with his staff, read the Soviet drafts, and said, "This is absolutely unacceptable. So he turned this completely on its head, rewrote in a sort of blitz, 48, 72 hours, a whole new set of documents that gave all the rights that Chiang Kai-shek had given away back to the Chinese. And under the interpretation that was offered in the 2011 version, he threw in a minor concession over Mongolia, giving the Soviets continuing control, but otherwise basically stuck it to the Soviets. A copy of the draft agreement has been found in the Soviet archives, and it shows that Stalin struck out almost every word in the Chinese document, putting profane marginal notations as he went along. 2 days after receiving the Chinese draft, the Soviets reversed position and accepted a slightly revised version with virtually all the Chinese proposals. Since that time, a later version of documents and a number of conversations with Soviet scholars have persuaded Professor Shin that Stalin, in fact, had decided before he received Zhou Enlai's draft that he would have to accept concessions to the Chinese. There are a number of things that were going on. The Indians and the British had recognized the communist government in China as the legitimate government. There were rumors in the press that Mao hadn't been seen in public and that he was under house arrest. The Soviets were starting to look increasingly bad, and Mao then began to put pressure on further when Stalin let him have an interview with Pravda. And he said directly in this interview that he planned to leave early if the Soviet Union would not agree to a new treaty of alliance and replace the 1945 treaty. So essentially, Mao went public, and the Soviet leadership decided that rather than having Mao stage a public outrage, they had better make significant concessions. From the point of view of my research, the difference doesn't matter a lot, except that it shows the phenomenon that we found in a lot of Cold War research when we got into the documents of the so-called satellite countries. And it's the effect of the supposed satellite country essentially whipsawing the major patron. And it's a category that we began to call tail wagging dog. So here's an Asian version. It did not leave good feeling among the parties. In basic analytical terms, Stalin abandoned his goals in Northeast Asia to accept the Chinese proposal for 3 different types of reasons. He did get a secure buffer in Mongolia, which solved one of his principal concerns. He was aware of the campaign by British and some Americans to lure the Chinese government into some strategic relationship with the West, and he wanted to end the possibility of an Asian Tito by cementing an alliance with Mao. And finally, and most importantly, Stalin decided on a new policy for Korea. If properly planned and executed, he saw a way to gain his goal of warm water ports in Asia, have a dependent ally in control of the Korean peninsula, and build a bulwark against further influence of a revived Japan on the Asian mainland. In Korea, Kim Il-sung had fairly easily taken control of the government with total Soviet support. You may remember that the Pacific War ended very rapidly with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union came into the war and raced to get troops into the northern part of Korea. In haste, they decided on the 38th parallel as the dividing line, and the Soviet forces were in very quickly and met only token Japanese resistance. before the Japanese, in fact, surrendered. Kim Il-sung, by the time of the Mao-Stalin negotiations, had made many requests for the Soviet Union to support an invasion of South Korea before Stalin decided at the end of January that he would begin discussions. Kim could not have understood why Stalin changed his mind. The Soviet leader was not in the habit of explaining his decisions to anyone. We can only guess at his motivations because he didn't keep a diary and he didn't talk in ways that his comrades would frequently write down. And he certainly wouldn't have explained his decision to a young protege like Kim Il-sung. Kim had fought Japanese forces in Korea and Manchuria as a young guerrilla commander in a Chinese communist unit. After his unit was almost wiped out, he and a band of survivors fled into the Soviet Union, into Siberia, where he spent the rest of the war, roughly from 1941 to 45. After the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in August of 45, Kim returned to Pyongyang with the Soviet occupation forces, wearing the uniform of a captain in the Red Army. With the sponsorship of the Soviet political commissar, Colonel General Terentij Stikov, Kim advanced rapidly to become Prime Minister of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea when it was founded in September 1948. At this point, the young leader was only 36 years old. Nevertheless, starting in March of 1949, he began launching a series of requests to Stalin and any Soviet official who would listen for approval to attack the South. Each repeal was rejected on the grounds that North Korea was not prepared militarily, the Chinese communists were still engaged in a civil war, and U.S. troops remained in South Korea. Then on January 17th, at a luncheon hosted by the North Korean foreign minister, Kim pleaded with now Ambassador Terentij Stikov to help arrange a trip to Moscow to discuss an invasion of the South with Stalin. To the great pleasure of Kim Il-sung, the Soviet dictator replied on January 30th, asking Stikov to tell Kim the following, quote, "I understand the dissatisfaction of Comrade Kim, but he must understand that such a large matter in regard to South Korea, such as he wants to undertake, needs large preparation. The matter must be organized so that there would not be too great a risk. If he wants to discuss this matter with me, then I will always be ready to receive him and to discuss with him. Transmit all this to Kim Il-sung and tell him that I am ready to help him in this matter." An optimistic Kim Il-sung arrived in Moscow with a sizable delegation on March 30th. They stayed in the Soviet capital for over 3 weeks. Kim had 3 substantive meetings with Stalin. The North Korean leader made a strong case that the United States would not intervene. He contended that his forces would launch a surprise attack that would capture Seoul and win the war in 3 days, that a force of 200,000 communists would rise against the South Korean regime to support the Korean People's Army, and that China, victorious in its civil war and now allied with Moscow, would help if difficulties arose. Stalin accepted Kim's arguments, but said that due to challenges in Europe, the Soviet Union would not become involved in the war beyond providing military assistance in planning the attack and providing supplies. All preparations were to be completed by midsummer 1950. And here this is in early April. The Soviet leader insisted that Kim consult Mao Zedong to get his approval and support as a condition of Moscow's assistance. In a blunt reiteration of this requirement, Stalin declared to Kim, according to the senior Soviet diplomat responsible for Korean affairs who was present at the conversation, Stalin said, "If you should get kicked in the teeth, I shall not lift a finger. You have to ask Mao for all the help." Well before Stalin and Mao approved the invasion of the South, the two communist powers worked to build up the North Korean armed forces. As early as June 1949, Moscow was transferring large quantities of weapons, from small arms to tanks and fighter aircraft. This sharply increased after April 1950. We have, courtesy of documents in Soviet archives, large lists of all the equipment that was requested, and virtually everything that Kim requested was approved. As the Chinese Civil War drew to a close, the People's Republic returned at least 70,000 soldiers, largely of Korean origin, to North Korea with their arms, providing a significant battle-tested core of an invasion force. While the Korean People's Army expanded, Soviet advisors arrived in Pyongyang to assist with training and to help develop a detailed plan of attack. As preparations for war continued, Kim Il-sung made the critical trip to Peking to win Mao Zedong's support. The North Korean leader and a small group of colleagues were in the Chinese capital for 3 days, starting May 13th. They met with Mao and Zhou Enlai on the evening of their arrival and on each subsequent day. Kim reported on the discussions with Stalin, emphasizing the changes in the international situation that had led the Soviet leader to endorse his plan for attacking the South. He added that he was asking now for Mao's approval, not his assistance. Mao replied that he needed to have Stalin verify what Kim had reported. Not a full measure of trust here. That same evening, the Soviet ambassador in Beijing cabled Mao's request, adding in conclusion, "The Chinese comrades request a speedy answer." The next day, Stalin replied in a deceptively general way, saying, and I quote, "In the conversation with Korean comrades, Stalin and his friends expressed an opinion that due to the changed international situation, they agree with the proposals of Koreans to commence unification. With this, it was agreed that the final decision on the issue must be made jointly by Chinese and Korean comrades. In case Chinese comrades disagree, the decision must be postponed until new discussion. Korean comrades can inform you about details of the conversation." Over the next 2 days, Mao and Kim, with their top advisors, discussed the proposed attack on South Korea. Kim described in very general terms his plan of attack. Mao replied that he wanted to liberate Taiwan. He had wanted to liberate Taiwan before dealing with Korean unification, but Stalin's approval of moving first in Korea had changed his mind. The Chinese leader asked what Kim thought about the possibility of Japanese or American intervention. Kim responded neither was at all likely, declaring that U.S. involvement would be a very serious event. Mao said that China would be prepared to intervene in Korea with at least 3 armies if the Americans entered the war and crossed the 38th parallel. Kim thanked Mao for his offer of support, but assured him it would not be necessary. On May 15th, at a dinner in honor of Kim Il-sung, the Korean leader reported to the Soviet ambassador, Envy Roshin, in Mao's presence, "Our negotiations with Comrade Mao Zedong went very smoothly. Comrade Mao Zedong completely approved the plan of the liberation. He supported what had been agreed upon in Moscow with Comrade Stalin." While this is going on in Moscow and Peking, there are significant developments going on in the United States, which gave Stalin and Mao sound reason to accept Kim's argument that intervention by the United States was very unlikely. The Truman administration had adopted a new Asian policy that called for reduced commitments on the Asian mainland in particular. The first step was to withdraw all American combat troops from South Korea, which occurred in June of 1950, leaving only a small military liaison group to train the army and police. The State Department added the next component when it issued the China White Paper in August. This weighty document attributed communist victory in the Civil War to the nationalist government, which was described as corrupt, reactionary, and inefficient. The new policy for Asia was codified and approved in NSC 48/2, adopted by the National Security Council and signed by the President on December 30th, 1949. This policy designated the priorities for U.S. initiatives as Japan, Okinawa, and the Philippines. And it said specifically that South Korea and Taiwan were outside the defensive perimeter that the United States would protect in a time of global war. The President laid out many of these points in a press conference on January 5th, 1950. And Secretary of State Dean Acheson was more detailed in his speech on Asian policy at the National Press Club on January 12th. The public statement about reduced U.S. commitments must have pleased Stalin as he dealt with Mao Zedong in Moscow and contemplated Kim's repeated requests for authority to invade. And the fact that Stalin almost certainly had access to the essential points of the full NSC/2 document through his well-placed spies in Washington and London would have strengthened even more his confidence in the plans he was formulating. At the same time as Asian obligations were reduced, pressure grew for the Truman administration to increase its armed forces to deal with a more powerful and extensive Soviet threat. In September of 1949, the President has announced to the country and the world that the U.S. Air Force had detected a successful Soviet atomic test 3 to 4 years in advance of our estimated timing. In September, news followed on October 7th of the founding of the German Democratic Republic in the Soviet occupation zone. And the same week, the Chinese Communists announced the creation of the People's Republic. The alliance between Moscow and Beijing and Peking was signed February 14th, 1950. Creating more anxiety was the shocking report of the arrest in February of British scientist Klaus Fuchs for atomic espionage. Seizing on this unfortunate series of events, Senator Joseph McCarthy began his assault on the weakness of the Truman administration and its protection of communists in high government positions with a speech February 9th in Wheeling, West Virginia. The Truman administration was clearly under fire, and it began to respond to these pressures with the approval on January 31st of an accelerated program to develop a hydrogen bomb. At the same time, the President authorized a comprehensive study of U.S. national security requirements that would eventually result in the decision document NSC 68, which would propose a major expansion of nuclear and conventional forces to meet the growing Soviet threat. Congress also passed and the President signed a $100 million economic and military aid package for South Korea in May. But when a draft of NSC 68 was submitted to the President in April, the President would not approve it until officials developed a full set of cost estimates for the massive military buildup the study proposed. When North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea on June 25, 1950, Truman had not yet resolved the contradictions in U.S. policy. The leaders of the communist nations that initiated and supported the war were justified in expecting that the United States would not come to the aid of South Korea. The chain of decisions made by the three communist leaders must be analyzed more closely. On the basis of the best evidence currently available, and we know that we don't have access to everything that exists in Moscow and Beijing, much less in Pyongyang, each of the three made a choice for war for different reasons and from a different calculation of risk. When Stalin decided on January 30th, 1950, to consider seriously Kim Il-sung's proposal to attack, he was in the midst of a series of unexpectedly tough negotiations with the new leaders of the People's Republic. In these talks, he could either choose to reject the Chinese proposals completely, thereby encouraging independent nationalist tendencies similar to Titoism, or he could make concessions in the Northeast to China. The Soviet dictator chose to make concessions because he realized he could get access to even better warm water ports in a unified communist Korea. And he could also block easy Japanese resurgence on the Asian mainland in the process. He limited risk to the Soviet Union by firmly declaring at the start of his talks with Kim that Moscow would provide only weapons and advice, but would not involve its own military in the war. That risk would be borne by Mao's China, or the deal was off. Stalin had effectively hedged his bet. Not what you would expect from an infirm and out-of-touch leader, which the West thought him to be. For Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the choices were more constrained. Their principal objective was to win a defensive alliance with Moscow as a protection against the strong pressure they expected to receive from the United States. Of almost equal importance was the elimination of the concessions of Chinese sovereignty that Chiang Kai-shek had granted to Stalin in 1945. The Chinese counter-proposal developed by Zhou Enlai and submitted January 26th demanded both of these top priorities. Given the power disparities between the two nations, this move was a huge gamble. The leaders of the PRC were pleasantly surprised when Stalin accepted their demands and final terms were worked out for an alliance. Chinese records give no indication that their negotiators understood why Stalin had made the decision he did. It's important to note that during these discussions, after Stalin has already invited Kim to come to Moscow, no mention of the Korean plans was made to Mao or Zhou. As he acknowledged to Kim Il-sung, Mao wanted to capture Taiwan, but he needed significant naval and air support from the Soviet Union to launch an attack. When Kim asked him for Chinese support for an invasion of South Korea, Mao realized that he could not do less than endorse the plan that Stalin had approved. He did not ask for a detailed explanation of the North Korean battle plan, nor did he make any careful evaluation of the respective North Korean and South Korean military capabilities. He apparently did not evaluate very fully the risks of being pulled into the war, although he did express concern about possible Japanese or American intervention. He did not even, for example, ask Stalin for assurances that China would receive the tanks, artillery, and airplanes it would need if it had to fight the United States. Mao just gave his blessing to the North Korean plan and hoped for the best. The Chinese made no plans or preparations for fighting in Korea, and in fact did not even establish an embassy in Pyongyang until after the war began. Kim Il-sung's decision-making was more transparent, if seriously flawed. Young and impetuous, he desperately wanted to unify Korea under his rule and convinced himself that his military forces could win a war against the South in 3 days. While many of his troops had recent combat experience in China, they had not been in Korea for several years and were armed largely with different types of small arms using different caliber ammunition. Those officers with combat experience had fought under close Chinese supervision and command. The Army had not trained together and was receiving the equipment and supplies from the Soviet Union only weeks before the invasion would begin. Kim clearly took the greatest risk in launching a war against South Korea, yet he seems not to have seriously considered what action to take if his attack stalled and the war dragged on for months. It is significant to note that he made no effort to explain his plan of attack to the Chinese or to prepare Mao to help North Korean forces if they faced deadlock or defeat. Indeed, Kim would not ask for Chinese assistance until he was only on the verge of being driven into Manchuria by MacArthur's advancing forces. And Stalin, in effect, directed him to ask the Chinese for help. While Kim Il-sung was clearly the instigator of the war, Stalin's support was the key element in starting the war when it began. Despite his recognized physical and mental decline, Stalin made reasonable decisions on the basis of the information available to him. Among his sources, Stalin's spy network in London and Washington provided access to much of the classified information about the new U.S. policy for Asia. And the Soviet leader was careful to hedge his bets. While the United States would completely reverse its declared policy and impose an embarrassing defeat on North Korean forces, Stalin's decision for war was justified on the basis of what he knew at the time. Even given how the war ultimately turned out, his decision was not as serious a strategic blunder as his 1939 pact with Hitler. The Korean War would prove much more costly for North Korea and the People's Republic of China than for the Soviet Union. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Sam, for your brilliant exposition. And I think there are lots of points for questions here. For a big audience, those of you who come on a regular basis will know that you have been spared one of our wonderful rituals, which is to go around the room and name your name, identify yourself so that our speaker knows who he's talking to. Instead of that, at least I would like to ask you, in Wilson Center tradition, to state your name and affiliation, if you like, as you take the microphone. So the floor is open.
I'm Stanley Falk. I'm a military historian. Wasn't there some serious discussion back and forth between Stalin and Kim on whether or not the Soviets would provide air support?
That discussion, Stanley, comes in October when the Chinese have to intervene. The Soviets had made it very clear that they had provided airplanes. They had done some rudimentary training of Korean pilots. This was literally sort of a 4-week course, and not the most rigorous course at that. And as a historian of the Air Force, you are very well aware that we destroyed that fledgling North Korean Air Force almost immediately. And the one advantage, our ground troops may have been in retreat, but we had the Air Force, and we were pounding from the start. This is getting ahead of these decisions. But what happens when the Chinese come in, Stalin has pledged air support to the Chinese, but he delays and delays in sending it. And the Chinese are terrified, or at least Mao is terrified. The Chinese Executive Committee of the Politburo is really split, and this is a whole separate story, but a very interesting one. Mao and one or two others are the only ones who initially support going into Korea. Everybody else says we need to care for the home front. We still have pockets of resistance from warlords and nationalist supporters. The country's in ruins. We need to pay attention to the home front. But Mao was firmly of the belief that sooner or later China would have to fight the United States, better fight them on Korean soil than on Chinese, and that if war was to come, let it come early. Now, there was a 4-day debate in the executive committee of the Chinese Politburo. They couldn't come to a decision. On the first vote, it was Mao and one or two others against about 8 or 9 of the military heroes of the Civil War. And Mao just continued to hammer away. And then he called Ping Dewa, who was his commander in the field, back. And he briefed him beforehand and said, I need your support. And they went into a long session of the Politburo. They finally agreed to intervene. The Soviets have still not provided the air cover. And so they intervene in mid-October. And they say, we still don't have the air cover. Shouldn't we wait? No, we're not going to wait. But what we are going to do is modify our attack plan. We will send in our top troops. We will identify where the South Korean forces are from the Western perspective, the U.S. and South Korean perspective. They were on the right flank. And they went after the South Koreans and completely demolished the South Korean force. Then they pulled back and went into the hills and waited. And we couldn't figure out what they were doing. In fact, they were waiting for Stalin to make a decision. Stalin couldn't figure out either. And Stalin thought, well, maybe they're going to just withdraw and not go any further. And so he had to rush the Air Force, the air supply in to help them. And as MacArthur is then starting what he says will be the victory march that will have the boys home by Christmas, the Chinese unleashed the massive force of 800,000 troops that come in and drive us all the way back, way below the 38th parallel. So the big debate about air cover comes in October of 1950, but it will come again because initially the Soviet Air Force will only fly to the Yalu. They won't come south of the Yalu. And when the Korean forces keep getting pounded with the B-29s, they finally authorize them to come further down. And for a time, the Russian pilots, you've probably seen some of the transcripts, but our intelligence reports show that we were getting some amusement out of the fact that the Russian pilots were trying to speak Korean. And were doing a rather poor job of it. And so after a little while, they stopped that and they were speaking in Russian. And we never officially called them on that. We knew there were Soviet planes, we knew there were Soviet pilots, and we did everything we could to shoot them down, but we didn't talk about who they were.
Sam, you've mentioned MacArthur. Could you say just a brief word of background about how this evolved from the view of Tokyo, the calculations?
MacArthur is an enigmatic and fascinating character. He had been among the first to say South Korea is not important. Let's get our troops out of there. When he was commander of the Far Eastern Theater, with his principal duties being the occupation and reform of Japan, he wanted to have nothing to do with Korea. Where he wanted to make a commitment was to the Chinese nationalists. He was very close to Chiang Kai-shek, and he wanted to support the nationalists, and he was looking for every opportunity to defend Taiwan, where the nationalists had withdrawn. And so when the war broke out, he thought this would be easy to handle. He thought the North Koreans would be easy. He sent in the forces he had. And from literally the first week of the war, he begins planning this invasion at Incheon, which everyone says is a bad idea. Incheon's the wrong place to do it. Anyone who's seen the mudflats there will understand why. If you have only 6 or 7 hours at high tide to get a large force in, he brings it off, and that's a large part of the story because the staff in Washington and all of the military who had experience in amphibious warfare in the Pacific, that is the Navy and the Marines, were violently opposed to this amphibious landing at Incheon. They would have done it at 2 or 3 other places, which they identified. But he wanted to do it at Incheon. They did it, and it was a huge success. From that point on, nobody is prepared to question MacArthur. He essentially, for the key decision of the war, that is crossing the 38th parallel, he made the decision. And while there were people in Washington who thought this was not a good idea, they didn't stand up to him. Everybody went along with it. And I will try to show in this book that I think that's the key decision. I quoted in here Mao's statement to Kim Il-sung in early April that if the Americans intervene and cross the 38th parallel, we're coming in with at least 3 armies. Well, they came in with a lot more than 3 armies, but that was an internal communist discussion. The interesting thing, of course, about all of this is these decisions that are going on, we know nothing about in Washington. Whereas Stalin, who's got most of the cards in his hand, has the chief counselor of the British Embassy, Kim Philby, who is the military security specialist and the liaison with our Atomic Energy Commission. He's a Soviet spy, and his right-hand man is working in the Foreign Office in London. And between them, they're getting all the information straight back to Moscow. So this is not, in terms of intelligence, not an even playing field.
Thank you.
I'm Al Schmidt from GW University. About Yakov Malik's walkout and then return, did you find anything? Obviously, you haven't touched upon this, so I don't mean to divert you too much, but was there anything in the Soviet sources about that walkout which occurred evidently because of Soviet disagreement about Chang, and then it allowed the Security Council, of course, to vote a UN operation instead of an American one. But I'm wondering if there's anything in the Chinese or in the Russian sources, Soviet sources.
There are some things about it, and in fact, I'll put in a plug here for the Cold War Project's new digital archive. If you want to go on the Center website and go to the Cold War Project and the digital archive and check the Korean War, you will find a lot of Soviet documents right there in English, translated by an army of Christians interns that tell you the debate that goes on. Initially, the walkout was approved as a show of solidarity to the Chinese communists. The Soviets were arguing they should have the China seat with veto power in the Security Council. And we and the British and a number of others voted against that. So he walked out. Once he was out, the foreign minister was arguing he should send him back, and Stalin said no. We can't reverse ourselves at this point. Nothing will happen. Well, of course, we used the whole UN justification to create a multinational mandate to do the war. And frankly, isolationists and conservatives and libertarians in the U.S. have been against the UN from that day since, in part because of that use of the UN that the Truman administration made at that time. But yeah, there was some debate in Moscow, but the big boss said, "Niet."
Yep.
Stephen Shore, I hate to speculate on counterfactuals, but any evidence, suppose Malik does not walk out and vetoes the UN force, any evidence that the United States would have acted unilaterally or just quietly agreed to the northern seizure of South Korea?
There's no question, Stephen. The State Department wanted to try and get the UN mandate Truman thought that was a good idea. The military said, if we don't get it, not only ever, if we don't get it within 48 hours, we're going ahead. And in fact, even before the vote was taken, Truman had authorized the armed forces to resist with all means. So MacArthur had troops on the way. The bombing had started of North Korean forces coming south. But we were already in it, and would have stayed in it. I don't think there's no question.
Thank you.
And I don't mind counterfactuals either.
Bob?
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Sam, what don't you know? For the period prior to the invasion, where are the holes in your story where you still would like further documentation from the other side?
Good question. It would be nice to know if there were any countervailing influences among this essentially dinner clique that Stalin had. I doubt if there were. Beria was a pretty unrelentingly hard line. And the foreign ministry didn't carry a huge amount of weight, and the foreign minister, Molotov, was sort of in and out of favor a bit in this period. And one of the things that's fascinating to look at is that there were arguments that Molotov was encouraging alternative policies. He made a mistake in the negotiation of the treaty with creating the German Democratic Republic. And there were people in the security services that wanted to make him pay a price. So they attacked his wife, who was also a prominent political figure and had been a minister. And the Politburo came up and said to Molotov, they removed Molotov as foreign minister and first deputy premier. He remained on the Politburo, but not on the executive committee. Stalin told him he had to divorce his wife. Molotov went home, thought about it, and came back and said, I'll do it. And his wife was then sent to a labor camp. And Molotov stayed there and in his reduced position and worked his way back. So within about 13 months or so, he was back as a deputy prime minister. But there's a period in there when he's out. And the foreign minister is Wyszynski. Wyszynski was not on the inside group. He just followed orders. The group would make up. Malenkov was exercising a lot of authority over the party and everything at this point. And, I mean, one of the best interpretations of this is our colleague Bill Taubman, whose biography of Khrushchev has been. I mean, Khrushchev's memoirs, you have to cross-check things because he is fairly expansive in his recollections. But Taubman's done the cross-checking, and it's a remarkable book and deserves the prizes that it received.
Thank you. I was sitting here and thinking whether I should ask the question I was going to ask or call on my senior colleague, Bob Hathaway. And out of deference to Bob, I called him and he, of course, asked the precise question I was going to ask. So that'll be a lesson to me. But let me not ask a question, but just make a comment here about the presentation. What I appreciated was the subtle historiographical readjustment that is going on with this presentation and with the book. You've seen over the last few years a wealth of new Chinese material come out of the archives, and the Cold War Project has promoted and supported this as much as we could. But I think not surprisingly, the pendulum of historical actors has sort of swung in the direction of the Chinese. This is actually not all that surprising. When the East German materials were released in the 1990s, suddenly Walter Ulbricht became the star of the Berlin crisis, and you have this in several other cases. And I think what Sam, you did very nicely, and I think an important facet here is bringing that pendulum back to the center, perhaps to Stalin, who really held many of the cards, and in particular, your readout of the Chinese Soviet discussions in January, February 1950, and Stalin's larger strategic calculations. I think will be an important, nuance to the scholarship here. But floor continues to be open for questions. Yeah, Konrad Jarosz, all the way in the back there.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Is there any material that you've seen that Stalin paid any attention to the repercussions that the Korean War would have in Europe? Because the theaters are linked in some ways. Did he just think that Asia was Asia and he could get away with it there? Because, NATO gets strengthened and all sorts of things happen in Western Europe. Including, the beginning of the economic miracle in Germany, in West and so on. And so, in the spirit of global history.
Well, that's what a large part of the book will be about. The trigger for the U.S. buildup is the North Korean invasion. But the most important outcome is not a deadlocked war in Korea. It's a strategic buildup which is focused mainly on Europe, which all of the key actors in the Truman administration believe to be both the principal goal for the Soviets and the principal asset we had to protect. So when you have the defense budget expanded by an order of 4, the CIA by a magnitude of 6, Strategic Air Command 4 to 5 times expansion, the vast majority of these assets go to Europe. One of the immediate decisions is 4 additional divisions to Europe, creating a integrated command for NATO and recalling General Eisenhower to active duty and sending him as the first Supreme Allied Commander. Stalin and the military in Moscow are very upset about this. I think basically we overreacted and that we caused them to do a lot more than they wanted to do in Moscow. Because what I look at further along in the book is the rapid expansion of assets from Moscow to a nuclear buildup and to the development from virtually nothing of a long-range air force. So they're trying to get as many weapons as they can, nuclear weapons, and they're trying to get a delivery system. And one of the interesting things that comes out, Christian talks about the nuance, in most of the literature, Lavrentiy Beria is thought of as a total butcher and thug. Stalin considered him his best administrator. And it wasn't just by intimidation and terror. Beria was in charge of both the long-range bomber and the nuclear weapons program. And he chose 2 men who were not party members and who were in some ways opposed to Stalin and talked back to him and could get away with it. The Igor Kurchatov was the major domo in the Soviet weapons program. He was Jewish, non-party member, had been attacked in various internal debates as being untrustworthy. And when he had to fire several engineers and senior people in the nuclear weapons program because they weren't performing, people came to Beria and said, "This is a Jewish conspiracy. You have to get rid of this guy." And Beria said, "Look, I don't care if he's Buddhist, Jewish, whatever. He is the best physicist we have. He's the best organizer we have. Until he fails, he's my man. And I don't want to hear any more of it. Well, that's a different barrier. We haven't seen that side. And he did the same thing with the major domo for the bombers. Although a bounder, a very ambitious younger aircraft designer, got directly to Stalin and said that the principal aircraft designer was not moving fast enough, and he wanted to try something, and he came up with an all-jet bomber, because what they were working on was turbojets before that. They didn't have the technology down to do an all-jet. And the new hotshot comes up with an all-jet bomber, and they build 17 prototypes, unprecedented. Normally you build 2 or 3. Build 17 prototypes, and when they started doing the test flights, 15 of them crashed. And the test pilots refused to fly the other 2. So, and Beria then intervened and told Stalin, you shouldn't have done that. I had this thing going along. We're doing the best we can. And, so it's an interesting sidelight that we now know. And the reason we know it, this is another interesting fact. It doesn't necessarily pertain to your question, but let me slide to it. This information was not available before the end of the Cold War. And it became available only when the prime customer for bombers and nuclear weapons was bankrupt, i.e. the Soviet government. At that point, the aircraft industry and the nuclear industry, in order to survive, had to sell to overseas companies, governments, and they did what a good Western company in trouble would do. They wrote a corporate history, taking out of the archives all those things that had been secret and saying, here's the great things we did. We produced this with primitive technology, we refined it, we redid all our metallurgy, we improved everything, et cetera, et cetera. So on the basis of these corporate histories, you can now see exactly what's going on in the nuclear weapons and long-range bomber programs in a way that our intelligence people would have salivated to be able to do years earlier. And now we've got it. So.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you for this chance. I'm Kiwon Sakala here. Originally, I'm from Seoul, South Korea. My question is similar to a former question. A certain scholar said Soviet did not support North Korea directly by its army, including Air Force, because Stalin wanted to expand his influence European countries during Korean War, exactly since the defeat of North Korean army. Is it correct? What's your opinion? Thank you.
My feeling would be that Stalin wanted to do both, to protect all of his interest in Western Europe and to expand his control in Asia. I think his risk calculation perhaps wasn't quite as thorough as he thought. It is true that as the war ground on into essentially a position warfare around the 38th parallel in 1951-52, Stalin did not provide the Chinese with the advanced weapons that they were requesting. And I think you could make an argument, although I have not seen the documentation to really justify it, that Stalin was happy for the Americans and the Chinese to grind one another down for maybe another year or so, which would keep both of them weak, or would make both of them weaker and make the Chinese more dependent on Moscow. That's my hypothesis, but it's not really part of the book, and I can't explore it, but it's a book that some of our younger scholars who look at Soviet-Chinese interactions could really devote a number of years to unraveling.
Thank you. We do have a number of our Chinese and other Korean scholars here, so you should feel free to join the discussion here. But let's go to the gentleman in the back. Yeah, no longer? Okay. Well, it's Kent Hughes.
Two quick questions. Was there no one in the American government that anticipated a move south once we drew the line where Atchison famously and Truman did? And second, why was our intelligence so lacking? We'd been dealing with the Soviets for a long time. We were in and out of China on many sides of the question. Why didn't we have some assets there?
Well, there were one or two people who thought this would be, that the pullout would invite a North Korean invasion. They were outnumbered, however, Kent, by the people who thought the real threat would come from South Korea, because Syngman Rhee in South Korea was threatening to invade the North. And the reason why he could not do that with great chance of success was that we had not given him any heavy artillery, very few tanks, and no aircraft. So he would have had trouble launching an offensive. We did this on purpose because in the period late 48, early 49, South Korean forces staged a number of raids across the border and tried to provoke a North Korean attack. And finally, our Army people and other disruptions in the South, economic demonstrations, forced Rhee to pull his forces back. But on the basis of what a senior official in Washington would have been reading, the chances looked much higher that the South would attack the North once we pulled out than the other way around. But the North Koreans obviously beat him to the punch. Now, I haven't seen anything to indicate the realization of how much extra hardware was going into North Korea. We didn't have reliable assets. We had people who were reporting, but they were, some of them double agents, and it was very confusing in Korea because the way the Korean movement developed, the communist movement developed in Korea, the majority of the communists were in the South. And there were huge numbers in the southern part, the southern provinces, and they had been for a time in revolt. So the government had real problems of dissent, and there were cadres of Koreans who were resident in the South who were then reinforced by teams sent in from North Korea. So these were the people that Kim Il-sung expected to have a big uprising. We knew pretty much about that, but we pulled out our combat intelligence people when we pulled the troops out. We just had a small training brigade of 250 people. And for intelligence in the Soviet Union, I don't think anybody had until the fledgling CIA sent, I don't know, 80 or 100 agents into Eastern Europe, most of them emigres. And every one of them was wrapped up and executed within days of their landing in Eastern Europe. We were, when you read, we had a presentation here, which Christopher Andrew spoke, and he talked about the way in which the British talked about the primitive skills and the spycraft of the American intelligence people, the fact that they had no real way of cross-hatching and checking their analytical views. And the CIA was really a very weak and inadequately staffed agent. And then when the war broke out and we added all these people, there was still not the kind of quality control you needed. So it took a long time for them to really get in shape. And the intelligence assets between Moscow and Washington were very unequally proportioned.
Thank you. Dr. Fadella?
Enrico Fardella from the center. First of all, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and I think it's very fascinating. I'd like to talk about this for hours. I think the time is quite limited, so I limit my question to two elements, very simple. One, whether you believe that there was like a strong domestic rationale in Mao's decision to join the war, and the second one is about sources, what we have from the Korean side, especially whether there is something available from North Korea.
Whatever we have from North Korea comes through our collaboration with the North Korea Unification University in Seoul. We have both a scholarly exchange and a series of meetings with them, and we get some very good information from there, although the information on North Korea is fragmentary and has to be carefully analyzed because they have a habit of putting a lot of disinformation in the things that go out. With regard to your first question about Mao's domestic interests, Mao was well aware that the Communist Party had strong established leadership in the countryside, but was very weak in the cities. And when they expanded their army to go to Korea, they took in a number of former nationalist soldiers who said they were willing to support the government, they were going to be good supporters of the People's Republic, etc. Mao was not fully persuaded. So he put these people of suspected loyalty in the front lines. And when we started to push back, they were the ones that got chewed up. There were tremendous casualties in that group. So his domestic justifications were both to solidify support for the government in a war effort against the great superpower and to do a little cleansing of potentially dissident elements. Mao was not a warm and cuddly guy. He was pretty nasty. So a lot of the former nationalist troops made a poor career move at that point, I think.
Thank you. By the way, there's curiously the largest number of North Korean documents is actually here at the U.S. National Archives that's come out of the country. There's a large collection, I think several thousand pages, James. 1.6 million pages of of captured documents. That is an underused resource and one that we are slowly trying to make an effort to get out into the into scholarly use. So,
in fact, when some scholars, Charles Armstrong to be particular, went in and exploited those documents, I think he was the first one to have seen them since they were brought over from the Korean War period.
And the tragic thing is that, of course, we not only are lacking the sources on the North Korean side, but similarly on the South Korean side, there's a lot of material that has been destroyed in decades. There, our Korean colleagues can amplify on that, but there's not the same level of documentation that we have on the Korean side, on either Korean side at this stage. And clearly, once at least some of those materials will become available down the road, there'll be yet another swing in the historiography. So, any other questions? Final comment, all the way in the back, and then we'll take that. Two final questions. Why don't we take those together and then give...
Jim Sang, everybody knows that the U.S. statements in 49 contracting U.S. boundaries were very important, but Moscow and Beijing have always been very suspicious about what the U.S. said. So do we have any records of an internal dialogue as to how much the U.S. statements could be taken seriously, whether this was a trick by the perfidious capitalists to lure us out, et cetera, et cetera? intelligence people like to do that, I gather.
And we'll take that question as well. Yep.
I am Sung-Yul Hong, a historian from South Korea, a public policy scholar in Wilson Center. According to your presentation, the incipient relationship between Soviet Union and China had a serious influence on the origin of Korean War. If so, how we can redefine the role of Kim Il-sung, who argued and appealed to start war in Korean Peninsula. His role is was so minor if we consider the real international relationship in East Asia, as I expected. And I'm also curious about Stalin's assessment on Korean Peninsula situation. I think Stalin also have some device and information on South Korea, not fully depend on Kim Il-sung. So really Stalin did believe South Korean government could collapse within three days from the start of the war? Is my question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the best we have on whether or not Stalin and or Mao agreed with the fact that we were pulling out is discussions that went on. And Stalin, of course, had a lot more information. He had the British, the man who was the prime spy in Washington, Philby, was sending reports about preparations of the Joint Chief to pull troops out. And so they really, they not only heard the message, they saw the feet moving. So I think it was pretty well believed. And Mao took it more seriously than Stalin. Stalin seemed to think that Kim's estimate of if he caught the South Koreans by surprise and captured Seoul, the rest of South Korea would collapse, because they really counted on the uprisings in the central and southern portions of South Korea to topple the rest of the government infrastructure. And they thought that the combination of the invading party and the uprising in the center of the country would do it in. So I think Stalin was comfortable going with that. Obviously, his military people did not, there's some among the groups that went in to help plan the invasion. They reported that the command structure and the experience and the command instincts of the North Korean leaders were not adequately professional. And they were concerned about these people, and the Soviet advisors, who really were shaping the whole invasion plan, asked if they could stay in South Korea and go with the invading force because they weren't sure the generals would do the right thing. And Stalin said, absolutely not. He said, in fact, I'm pulling all of you out a week before the invasion. So Stalin was very cautious. He did not want to risk getting into a military confrontation with the U.S. And at this point, he didn't know if the U.S. was going to intervene. He assumed they weren't. That was his thinking. But he said in numerous communications with South Korea that my principal concern is to avoid a military confrontation with the United States. And he stuck to that. That's when he pulled the pilots back and so forth later in the war. Now you say, well, the role of Kim Il-sung. Given the North Korean literature, as I, and with the help of some very experienced interns, go through it, the best you can piece together from all the source material is that Kim was brought to power and kept in power in large part by Soviet sponsorship. The Soviets in the period 47, 48, 49 told him who to promote, what policies to follow, and so forth. Now, he did take command at the early stages of the invasion. He went to the front, I think, 4 times. But after the Incheon invasion, when the North Koreans were getting completely destroyed and were in rapid retreat, the Chinese came in, and then there's a joint command. Kim doesn't want to give up command of the North Korean forces. Remnants only were surviving. The Chinese commander goes to Mao and says, this guy won't listen to me. I can't run a divided command. I want to take over. And Mao goes to Stalin and says, this divided command is not working. Stalin sends a very clear and blunt order to Kim Il-sung: the Chinese are in command. I support them completely. From this point on, Kim is marginalized. He has no authority in the conduct of the war. And it's not even clear what he's doing or where he is. But so the Chinese take it over. And at that point, it's essentially a Chinese-American contest.
There's an important article by Chen Shua on the subject in the bulletin. The German in me is happy that we're right on time. Unless, Roger, you have anything else to add, both of us would like to invite you to continue the conversation with Sam over a glass of wine outside, but not without giving him a round of applause for this tremendous presentation. Thank you. Thanks for coming. We're adjourned.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know about that. But you should read Professor Shen. So Sherry wanted to have a word with you. In the red sweater.